Good afternoon. We're really changing gears. This talk is about induced abortion or elective abortion. And that is to distinguish it from miscarriage. So when I say abortion, I mean, induced or elective abortion. Now, some of you in the audience are probably familiar with the journal that Dr. Orient edits, and it's freely available on the internet, and it has some really good articles, including a few on abortion. And on the first slide, what you see is, from an article by Priscilla Coleman, that abortion is really unique in medicine. No other medical procedure has received constitutional protection. And in medicine, we usually try to deal with and use nature to heal the patient. But in the case of abortion, it is an unnatural reversal of a woman's body, which results actually in death. So it is really counterintuitive to anything that medicine is supposed to be. So let me say something in a nutshell that sort of presents the whole rest of my talk in very short, condensed version. As doctors for disaster preparedness, our topics are usually current and anticipated and avoidable disasters. So when we talk about disasters, we should think about what are the biggest disasters worldwide. And there is, without any doubt, abortion is the biggest past and current anthropogenic disaster. It claims more victims than communism, and therefore we should be in the vanguard of leading the fight to not limit or reduce abortion, but to abolish abortion. This is not a religious issue, despite the fact that most people who are pro-life and fight against abortion come to it from a religious reason, from a religious perspective. But I think I'll show you a negative aspect of that in a few slides. Abortion is a massive human rights violation. It follows, and the fight against abortion follows the biological evidence, the life science evidence, which all the people in favor of abortion never talk about. What is the biological evidence? And in light of all these factors, it is the ethical thing to do. So let's start with something that most of us are not quite aware of. The most dangerous time in life for any human being is being inside the womb of the mother. So the womb is just about everywhere a free fire zone. To various extents, in the United States it's especially bad, but in a lot of other countries it is almost as bad. Now, in the United States itself, it is an unmitigated disaster. On the left side of the slide, you see the children killed by abortion compared to American deaths in every war since the Revolution. And each cross signifies 1 million. And you notice there that the deaths by abortion, the killing of Americans by abortion, far exceeds that of any casualties in all of our wars combined. The graphic on the right is even, in my opinion, more illustrative, and that shows the violent deaths in the United States. Again, compared abortion, all the red, versus all the other wars combined. By the way, this graphic was on the internet apparently until a few years ago. I downloaded it from some Wikipedia. It's no longer available on an active website. So we're always talking about the war against the unborn when we talk about abortion. But is it really a war? In a war, somebody shoots back at you. It's really a slaughterhouse. Now, to drive that point home a little bit more, here we have a map of the central United States, and all these blacked out states, in addition to them, Louisiana there on the southern end, that would be vacant of any people if we just take the number of abortions since Roe v. Wade in 1973. That means if we hadn't had freely available abortion ever since then, we would have the population of these states now. Now, on the right-hand side, you have a statistic that is a little bit different from all the other numbers that you see later on, because it says that, for example, 3,300 babies every day are being aborted. That's no longer true. It's about 2,000 now. But that is the result of the effort of Mark Crutcher at Life Dynamics and some other people associated with him that have systematically tried to shut down abortion clinics by such methods as accusing them and suing them for not following medical standards, for not having access to hospitals in case an abortion gets botched and the patient needs more intensive medical care, those kinds of efforts. By the way, some people might argue about that, oh, your numbers are slightly different and they don't really compute completely, but the order of magnitude is what is important. And the order of magnitude is still roughly 60 plus million abortions each year in the United States. Let me stay with this slide for one more point, and that is, if people argue about, oh, is it really 61 million, or is it 59 or 58, or as in this slide, 56 million, that reminds me a little bit of the argumentation that I heard as a youngster growing up in Germany among people who discussed the Holocaust, and some people were arguing, oh, it wasn't 6 million Jews who were killed, it was just 4.5. What kind of an argument is that? Okay, so we shut down Treblinka, but the chimneys in Auschwitz continue to smoke. What kind of, benefit is that? Now, worldwide, the situation is even much worse. Worldwide, we kill each year just about as many babies as have been killed and are being killed in the United States since the legalization of abortion by the Supreme Court in 1973. And these are numbers that you see there, to the extent you can read them, that come from the Guttmacher Institute, which is one of the Planned Parenthood founders. So these numbers are, if anything, probably on the low side. Okay? So these are not numbers being put out by the anti-abortion or pro-life activists. Again, it is a war of annihilation, which another name for that is genocide, because especially if, the Jews weren't able to shoot back, the babies aren't able to shoot back. You may not be able to read clearly all these numbers, but there is a very good website, usabortionclock.org, on which you can see the abortions in the United States today, abortions since 1973 in the US since Roe v. Wade by Planned Parenthood, since 1970, this year, etc. And then you see in the middle, you see some other numbers, and on the right-hand side, you see worldwide since 1980. And that number is staggering. That is over 1.5 billion babies worldwide having been killed in the womb since 1980. The one number I wanted to elaborate a little bit on is the one on the bottom in the middle, black babies since 1973 in the US, about 18.5 million babies. Some people have noticed that Planned Parenthood clinics are usually close to low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. Well, there's actually a very active group of folks called the Radiance Foundation that is engaged in the pro-life fight. And that statement up there on the top left is by those folks. Abortion does not advance colored people, and since we are all colored people, most people in this room have the color pink, it doesn't advance any community. And then you notice the sign, less activism, more factivism. I think that's a motto that Doctors for Disaster Preparedness could also subscribe to. And if you then look at the number one killer of the black community in the United States, that is not diabetes, accidental death, cancer death, heart disease, or any of those, but it is abortion. It kills more black babies than anything else. And you can go for that and research that with the beginnings of Planned Parenthood, where there was a lady named Margaret Sanger who was the start of that, and she was definitely a racist. By the way, here I can put in a plug. I have outside on one of those tables, I have a bunch of books that are on the pro-life perspective where you can learn more about this entire issue. So you're welcome to browse through those during the breaks. We need to talk about language, because language is usually the start of any barbarism. You cannot really kill somebody else, far less, let's say, 6 million Jews, unless you first declare them in your language to be non-human. So semantic distinctions in any discussion of abortion or any other life and death issue, they matter. It matters, and I'm not going to go into explaining in detail every one of them, but it matters whether you say die or kill. One is active, the other one is passive. One is natural, another one is unnatural. Or letting die, or foregoing treatment, or withholding treatment. And then, of course, one of the favorite euphemisms of the pro-abortion side is termination of pregnancy. Well, any pregnancy gets terminated one way or the other. It's just a natural termination leads to birth. And these euphemisms, and I'll go more into those, they are calculated. This disregard of distinction is calculated in order to confuse, to have that morally flattening and coarsening effect. And of course, as all the doctors in the audience know, what is the first commandment in the Hippocratic Oath? First, do no harm. So let's talk about a little bit of Greek language. Epsilon, pronounced U, means good. Omicron, epsilon, also pronounced U, is not. And many of us probably know that the word utopia employs that deliberate ambiguity in saying it's either a good place or no place. Whether Erasmus or Thomas Morris or anyone else writing about utopia wrote about that subject. So now we come to euphemism. Euphemism is a good-sounding word that covers something that is not good. Or it's an empty word that means absolutely nothing and obscures what the real meaning is. So let me read you the quote on the bottom there by Fowler, the famous grammarian. Every now and then a word emerges from obscurity into sudden popularity. It is often but not necessarily one that by no means explains itself to the average man, who has to find out its meaning as best he can. His wrestlings with it have usually some effect on it. It does not quite mean what it ought to, but to make up for that, it means some things that it ought not to. And from the dictionary of the abortion-friendly folks, we know the terms abortion care, women's health care. I don't need to read all of those to you, the first two columns. But the third column we're also familiar with. Euphemisms that were designed, intended to hide what was really going on. Liquidation of the class enemy by the communists, killing them by a shot in the head. Final solution, the Nazis versus the Jews. Population exchange, the expulsion of people from their original homeland into the wilderness. That corruption of language by euphemisms and others has a long and sordid tradition. Some of you may have heard of or even read the diaries by Victor Klemperer, a German Jew in Dresden who survived actually the years from 1933 to 1945. And in his diary, he actually occasionally mentioned special words that the Nazis were using, and they had an entirely different meaning in reality, and he called it the lingua tertii imperii, which is Latin for the language of the Third Reich. And later on, a book was published with that LTI, language of the Third Reich. So I suggest, especially to this group here, that maybe we can extend this concept. We can come up with the acronym of LVI, the Lingua Viridis Imperii, the language of the Green regime, and then, as far as abortion is concerned, the language of the abortion regime. By the way, that's a very well-known, thing that's going on. There's a French book on totalitarian language, and it has newspeak, that's just the French word for newspeak, and then the Klemperer word, and then a language of the fourth government in France. And my personal favorite, I have already sort of alluded to it, with Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood, is eugenics. Eugenics was a craze or fashion or ideology that is really analogous to the current craze about climate change, etc. And none other than Michael Crichton wrote about it in an appendix to his book, State of Fear. And what he mentioned in there is all these people who were in favor of eugenics. And these are some people we know very well and institutions that we know very well, and others We are surprised. We hear that Churchill was in favor of eugenics. Who would have known? But that whole eugenics craze was accepted by everybody, just as abortion is accepted today as a matter of fact, nothing special, and hopefully it will go down into the dustbin of history, just as eugenics did. What is the real meaning of pro-choice? It is I get to choose whether to let you live. And it is the belief that female liberation is built at the expense of other human beings. And in that context, it is a cloak for progressive barbarism. Because we all know, the medical professionals in the audience more than anybody else, human life, an individual human life, begins at conception, at fertilization, ends at death. And whatever the courts say, they cannot uncreate life. You can only end a life in death. So every abortion ends in death. And in this country, we have a history of slavery. And that history got finished by the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment said we cannot treat humans as property. And then we started, especially since Roe v. Wade in 1973, a second period of treating human beings as property, which deprives humans again of the inalienable right to life. Abraham Lincoln said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. By analogy, if abortion is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Human embryos are people, they are not property, and when courts decide about the fate of those human beings, these decisions should be made in their best interest. We come back to the language. We cannot kill anyone before we actually dehumanize them by language. Dehumanizing members of our own species, of Homo sapiens, which the unborn undoubtedly are, is just as wrong as dehumanizing Jews, class enemies, or anybody else. Planned Parenthood was mentioned briefly. Planned Parenthood is the most prominent abortion provider in the United States, and they're making lots of money doing it. Planned Parenthood gets over $500 million of our tax dollars each year, which they don't spend and are not allowed to spend on abortion, but it frees their other donations for doing abortion. So they are getting rich off the fat of the land, in this case, the unborn. They are just as bad as the Nazis for the unborn as the Nazis were for the Jews. Now, there's a really strange contradiction. In recent years, Live Action revealed how Planned Parenthood trades in baby body parts. In order to abort a baby, Planned Parenthood tells the mothers, well, it's not really a human being. But then when they trade the body parts, apparently these are human body parts, because otherwise they couldn't be used in humans. So I was thinking, especially in light of current fashionable propaganda, wouldn't it be great if the preborn could speak and they would say, please declare me a trophy animal, because then PETA, World Wildlife Fund, mainline media, and so on, maybe they'll stop ignoring me, that I'm really a human being, and maybe they'll start defending me. Back to language. We have to look at the defense of the indefensible. Most people who defend abortion, they come to you with the hard cases. They talk about exceptions, and they say, well, maybe even if we outlaw abortion, we need these exceptions for rape and incest. Well, either it is a member of the human species or not. It doesn't matter how it came about. If we defend the rape and incest exception as a self-defense theory, how different are we then from the old Greek mythology figure of Medea, who was killing her children to punish her husband, who picked a different woman? So usually, in our law courts, We are saying we cannot punish children for the parents' misdeeds. So that self-defense argument in rape and incest just does not hold morally, philosophically any water. You cannot defend yourself against an innocent by killing an innocent third party, which in rape and incest the unborn child is. A baby conceived through violence is just as blameless and innocent as one that is conceived in marriage. It deserves the same protection. And what was valid about the Abraham Lincoln quote earlier is valid here. Either all preborn babies are worth saving or none of them are. If you are conceding exceptions, you're conceding that some human beings are less than human beings, which gets you right there on the slide down to the Nazi philosophy. The health of the mother is another one of those arguments that is a total non sequitur, especially in light of the legal history of that, because the health of the mother, according to the Supreme Court definition and the definition that it incorporated from the World Health Organization, includes the physical, emotional, psychological, familial, and the women's age, as well as financial well-being and psychological well-being, which really means there is no restriction on abortion at all. It's abortion on demand for the full 9 months of pregnancy for no reason, for any reason. So the health of the mother is not just a slippery slope, that's the bottom of the slope, because it excuses anything. That brings us to one example of the political dialogue about abortion, and I'm not going to go into what the Democratic candidates said during their recent two fora that were televised. Best example for the total illiteracy of the pro-abortion argument, or the not pro-life argument by politicians, in my opinion, was the candidate forum moderated by Rick Warren in 2008, where he asked the candidates, both John McCain and Barack Obama, at what point does a baby get human rights? McCain answered it correctly, and Obama said, that's above my pay grade. And then he realized that was a bit too glib, so he later in an interview with Stephanopoulos said, well, you know, I'm not really able or presume to answer these theological questions. So he went into the theological arena. That's a dodge. Any textbook on biology, especially human biology, says that a human life begins at conception or fertilization. That has nothing to do with theology. So the theological twist tries to make the whole issue ambiguous. Obama also is a lawyer. And one of the principal foundations of Western jurisprudence is in dubio pro reo, Latin phrase for in doubt for the accused. So, if I have a doubt about whether it is a human being or not, that unborn that is being killed by abortion, then I need to rule in favor rather than against. But the pro-abortion side and the politicians who run away from that issue or try not to address it, they are going against that standard. And hardly anyone ever makes that argument. Now, the abortion really really started in force in this country in 1969, and I'll have another slide later on that. But one of the founders of the National Abortion Rights Action League was Bernard Nathanson, who turned from being an abortionist to later a pro-lifer. He was the author of the video, The Silent Scream, which some of you might have seen. It pictures an abortion in the womb through ultrasound. And these leaders of the early abortion movement, they decided deliberately to make the Catholic Church their foil as a freedom-smothering oppressor. You know, it was very easy for them to accuse the Catholic Church of misogyny and basically say that the Catholic Church is opposed to abortion only because they hate women. After all, they don't ordain priests. The Church's real motive was to restrict women's freedom. So, in the very beginning, 1969, these people took the theological argument and they knew it was going to work for them. That's why they came up with that idea. One of my main points here today is that you can be against abortion without having a religious reason. Abortion is wrong. It's morally wrong. Now, if you think it's wrong for religious reasons, that's fine. But it's wrong regardless. I dedicate this presentation to the memory of Doris Gordon, who founded in 1976 Libertarians for Life. And there are two quotes by her. Roe v. Wade, the court announced itself unable to answer the question of when life begins. Well, if they were unable to answer that question, they should have gone with in dubio pro reo, in doubt for the accused. They went against that. And then she actually quotes Ayn Rand, who was somebody who was bitterly opposed to pro-life people. I think that was one of her significant flaws. She had a few others. But she also, of course, said a lot of very useful things, and that's what Doris Gordon quotes there. She said the question is, who should decide? And Ayn Rand said, whoever can prove it. You need to intellectually work through your reasoning and then prove it. So Doris Gordon was a Jewish atheist. And she was 100% pro-life. And if you go to Libertarians for Life, Google that, you still find the website and you find all those non-religious arguments in favor of life. Another very prominent pro-life advocate was Ned Hentoff, long years columnist for the Village Voice. And he was a very iconoclastic thinker, very much an advocate of the First Amendment. And he was another Jewish atheist who was very much in favor of life. Being without theology is the slightest hindrance to being pro-life. And just to give you an example of some small groups, unfortunately, that are also fighting pro-life, Atheist Agnostic Pro-Life League, and then even an LGBT pro-life outfit. So it's not just religious people who are pro-life. Quote from Doris Gordon, my pro-life position is derived entirely from philosophical and scientific ideas, and I agree with her on that. Actually, my first pro-life thought was, well, these women are saying, my stomach is mine. I know biologically that's not the woman's body. That just happens to be inside of her. And I said the biology of that is screwed up, and that was my beginning of being pro-life. And that was almost 50 years ago. And I think for this audience, especially of interest might be, I am very sure the evidence for the humanity of the preborn is much stronger than the evidence for anthropogenic global warming. We'll take a short detour. It has bugged me actually for many years. Desirable modern woman is supposed to have to be modified for beyond or against her nature to achieve perfection. That means in order to love a woman, she needs to be considered lovable by a man, she must be fixed first. She must be either chemically fixed by taking the pill or other things mechanically, or must, if something goes wrong, she must be relieved or vacuumed out of the unwanted products of conception. Now, this is a position by liberals and progressives that otherwise are in favor of natural living, of organic nutrition, of green ecology, of back to nature, of all those things. It's a stupendous contradiction. Something very simple. On the web, you find usually on the menstrual cycle, you find these circles about, when the bleeding, the periods, the infertile days, the fertile days, etc., etc. On the right-hand side, though, you have something in a little bit more detail. And that is by an advocate of natural family planning, which works very well. And it's a circle that shows you exactly that you have to observe the mucus in the cervix, and if there is mucus, if you don't want to conceive, then stay away from intercourse. And if there is if there's mucus and you want to conceive, then you have intercourse during that time. By the way, this is not just Tom Hilgers and his Paul VI Institute in Omaha, but this is actually acknowledged also by the American College of Gynecologists and Obstetricians. This is straight from their website. If you want to prevent pregnancy, if you want to promote pregnancy, This is well-known stuff. And this is natural, without chemistry, without mechanical devices, so it works very well. And just to briefly address in vitro fertilization, the moral argument against in vitro fertilization is that every fertilized egg, every embryo is a human life. It's an individual human life. And if you use IVF and you save those embryos or destroy them, then you're actually either suspending lives or you're killing lives. Both of them are unnatural. We have to face, in the pro-life argument, in the pro-life battle, we have to fight several diversionary tactics and evasive maneuvers. The first one, we already briefly talked about it, and I believe, I'm convinced after over 30 years, essentially, involved in this work, that anytime anyone argues religiously, they're actually helping the pro-aborts, because that's what they wanted from the beginning. And I gave you the example of Bernard Nathanson, and associate with him was Garrett Hardin and Betty Friedan and a few other associates. So it has nothing to do with religious opinion or dogma. Again, if you come to the pro-life fight from a religious background, fine. But I think you have to ask, everyone individually has to ask him or herself, is my goal to proselytize and save souls? Or is my goal to save unborn babies? And they sometimes are not the same, or often they are not the same. Then a woman's issue. Well, obviously fathers are involved in the creation of a child, but only the mothers have the discretion to choose. And of course, it's obviously not just a woman's issue, because a little bit less than half of all aborted babies are male. Then there's something that I consider almost pernicious, and that's that whole life seamless garment idea. And Democrats for Life, a small group within the Democratic Party, they are pursuing that. Essentially, and I'll go into it in a little more detail in the next slide, they are saying, well, we're also against the death penalty, or if you want to be against abortion, in order to be credible, you have to be also against the death penalty. And then it's a little bit exaggerated, but very little only, that the minimum wage is almost as grave a question as euthanasia. And that all goes into the sort of rhetorical trick that has been called whataboutism, or our British friends sometimes call it whataboutery, or mission creep. I think with all of those diversionary tactics, everyone who talks about abortion and pro-life, they need to insist on, before we continue any discussion on any of all these other related or marginal issues, stop the killing. Before you negotiate, at least stop the killing. So some examples of that whataboutism or whataboutery, you're not really pro-life unless you condemn capital punishment, demonstrate against nuclear war. You can see all that stuff. Now, who benefits from all of this? Cui bono, the ancient question. Of course, the abortion profiteers benefit from it, whether it is NARAL. And by the way, let me just give you an example of how NARAL sort of changed its code several times. It started out as National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. Then it was renamed into National Abortion Rights Action League. And now it is, and then it was National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League, so the euphemism sort of increased. And today, they don't even have that national abortion in their name anymore. It's just NARAL, the acronym Pro-Choice America. Okay? But they are definitely benefiting from it. Then there's a group such as FIREPAC, another acronym, I'll have that in the next slide. Of course, who really benefits from abortion? Irresponsible males and females. Okay. Abortion is sort of the dream of irresponsible males. Older humans that benefit at the expense of younger human beings. And I always found it amazing that, there's that oxymoron alert. People say, for some babies, especially that might be born into an adverse environment, it would be better if they were never born, or if they were aborted, than if they were carried to term. Well, to me, I always thought that only religious people that believe in an afterlife can make that argument. Because if you don't believe in an afterlife, that means if you die, there's nothing. You say nothing is better than something. How can you make that point? Nevertheless, in reality, it's exactly the other way around. People who call themselves liberal or atheists, agnostics, etc., they say, well, he might be better dead than alive. Whereas the religious people usually say, save that baby. I have that acronym up there in the first line on the right-hand side. You probably have never seen it before. That is a European outfit. It's a federation of abortion and of abortion professionals and contraception associates. If you go to the NARAL website, you don't really see anything beyond the PR outreach effort. That means they don't have on their website copies of their presentations from their meetings and that sort of thing. You just see what they want you to see. But when you go to this website, the federation, that European federation there, they actually have the presentations of their meetings, of their conferences on their website. So if you really want to see what these people think, that is a real good website. Study the enemy, know what the enemy is up to. They're fairly recent. I think they got started 2007 or 2009. And they were really one of the driving forces behind the legalization of, or supportive forces behind the legalization of abortion in Italy, Spain, Ireland, and they are working on Poland now. Poland is their next target. You know, these Catholic countries, they were falling like pins. Today is the anniversary not just of the first man on the moon, that's 50 years ago, but 75 years ago, it was also it's today the anniversary from 75 years ago, the 20th July 1944, the assassination attempt on Hitler that unfortunately failed, Operation Valkyrie. You might remember the Tom Cruise movie. Also, we have now, 50 years since the beginning of NARAL. If you look on the right lower side, March 3rd, 1969, NARAL opens for business. Then on the left, of course, July 20th, Armstrong on the moon. We all know what happened with our moon exploration. The end of that, of manned travel to and from the moon, that was in December 1972, so barely 2.5 years. Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt coming back. And what have we had since then? 2019, up on the top. No human on Mars, no base on the moon. What do we have on the other side? NARAL started at exactly the same time. That's real progress. Over 60 million American children murdered. Now, if that is not a call to action, I don't know what is. Let's give some historical context, because some people say, oh, that fight is just too dangerous. I don't want to, enter in those discussions. I'm going to tick off my friends, my neighbors, even my family members. In my case, I know exactly I'm ticking off a bunch of family members if I talk about abortion and pro-life. Well, Kurt Gerstein, he lived from 1905 to 1945. He actually entered the SS with the purpose of learning more about what the Nazis were really up to. And he was sent to Belzec and Treblinka, and he witnessed the gassing of Jews. The gassing not as in Auschwitz with Zyklon B, but with the exhaust of diesel engines. And he tried to inform everybody he could think of. He met a Swedish diplomat on the way back to Berlin and told him the story. He tried to tell the Vatican through the papal nuncio in Berlin. Other ways. Nobody believed what he was saying. He was risking his life to do that. He knew what was going on, and he risked his life to do something about it. At the end of the war, he surrendered to the French, and he was found dead in a French prison, and nobody knows how he died, whether he died, committed suicide, or possibly he was murdered by other SS officers that were prisoners with him. Costa Gavras, the Greek director of movies, made a movie about him that's called Amen. I'm mentioning this fellow. He saw mass murder right in front of him. He tried to inform the world. He risked his life. We know about the mass murder in our midst and in our name and supported by our tax money. What is the real risk that we would expose ourselves to if we did something about it? How many veterans of World War II and early on later war do you think fought for the constitutional right to have an abortion? I guarantee you pretty much not one. And the answer, I think, is verified by that song that was popular in 1945, and I had never heard of Rosalie Allen before, but you can go on YouTube and you can hear that song. Hitler lives if we hurt our fellow man. Hitler lives if we forget. Quote of one of the co-workers of Doris Gordon, the founder of Libertarians for Life: "It is far more comfortable and popular to provide a window-dressing justification and ignore the question of inconvenient little facts in the real world." We have had several speakers here before us that talked about how their real data have been ignored by the science community. So we know that's going on pretty much everywhere. And I have talked on similar subjects before this conference in the past on radiation protection and those kinds of things where we ignore the real data. If we confront the moral complexity of abortion, if we really see what it is, most of us are behaving like the Germans during the Nazi regime. We don't really want to look because we are afraid of what we might find and what we think we would have to do and who will be guilty. See, the Germans and the people of occupied countries that actually did something about the Nazis and Hitler, they risked prison, torture, and death. Or in the communist countries, likewise, in the East Bloc countries, they risked prison, torture, and death. What in the world do we risk if we speak up, if we do something? And let me just throw in a little thought here, a little additional thought. A lot of pro-lifers, they talk pro-life, but they don't do anything pro-life. And a lot of people who do something pro-life are basically, in my opinion, buying themselves indulgences. Okay, I'll drop a 20 here and I'll drop a 50 here for the local pregnancy center, etc. But other than that, forget it. Meanwhile, the mass murder goes on. Do we really think that's enough? We need to look at political realities. Political realities are that people like me who speak about abortion might make a point and might be understood in a forum like this. But if I were to run for political office, I would be immediately vilified as a man who doesn't know anything, and by the way, he's old, he's no longer, his wife is no longer in childbearing age and whatever, irrelevant. So from a PR and political perspective, what we need women to lead the pro-life fight. And we have in the past heard from, I think, a son of Phyllis Schlafly one time. We need basically pro-life Phyllis Schlafly type ladies that run the fight. Of course, each one of those ladies must be supported by the men behind them. But if the men are the face of the pro-life fight, they'll be discounted right from the get-go. So we need female candidates, and we need them in both parties. The Democrats for Life, for example, are only a very small group, miniature, minuscule, 1 ppm or 1 ppb maybe in the Democratic Party. But they are there, and that is one way of carrying maybe the pro-life bacillus into the Democratic Party. So look them up on the web. I disagree with a lot of stuff that they do, but they're at least nominally pro-life. So what we must do is we need to spit in the face of death. We need to do it actively. And let me encourage with this phrase, l'chaim, to life. Thank you.
although I'm a pro-life activist, I still would like to know why women have abortions. And I think we're talking about, when you're talking to the group we're talking here, we're talking to people that are enlightened, that know this. But we have a lot of African countries, we have a lot of third world countries that don't know why and how. And wouldn't it be good to have more education than just rather than condemn them?
Of course, I agree. But education also with not just in the techniques, the technology, but also in the moral and philosophical foundations. Yes.
Hello, I appreciate your presentation. So I don't refute this abortion is morally wrong. But I think my struggle with this establishment of morality is that it does not lend us any practical guidance. By that I mean, if we outlaw abortion, so as far as I see, there might be two alternatives. Women, they could seek illegal solutions. They could go to China or Mexico to get a job done, or they could abandon their children. So I'm not sure whether these two alternatives would be better in any sense. And also, just a philosophical thinking, do you think in some circumstances, nothing would be better than suffering and pain?
I don't know how you can make that philosophical argument that nothing is better than something, but we could maybe offline talk more about that. But I just don't see how that argument can be made. But that would be the suffering of the woman versus of the mother versus the life of the baby. Okay? So let's put it on a different plane, and that is any German or other person that was opposed to the Holocaust or trying to save Jews from the Holocaust. Would anyone have required from them that they also had the means to actually provide those Jews they saved with a safe, comfortable home, or basically anything else but saving their lives? If we really agree that the babies, or preborn, prenatal babies, are human beings, then are they not just as worthy of not being killed, regardless of what else happens to them later on? I mean, if I save a Jew from the gas chamber, does that mean now I need to also take him and, you know, put him up in my house, etc., etc.? By the way, a lot of that is being done by pro-lifers. There are now more caring pregnancy centers in the United States than there are Planned Parenthood clinics. A lot more. So there is help. There's no excuse anymore from material or other circumstances for not carrying a baby to term. There are plenty of, for example, also potential adoptive parents out there. There are not enough children to be adopted by everyone who wants to adopt, for example. But again, the first order is do no harm. An abortion does harm, it kills the baby. Stop the killing first. We can talk about, you know, if I put myself in the role of someone in Nazi Germany, we can talk about sending the Jews to Madagascar or selling them to the British or whatever. But first, stop the killing.
Do you think we have better solutions than adoption?
We do.
Like what?
Again, if I'm the husband of a lady who has run a pregnancy counseling center for 35 years. And I know from that experience and from other people in the field that there are more adoptive parents, potentially adoptive parents out there than are babies available for adoption. So that, you know,
So you are saying in terms of practical solutions to some unfortunate circumstances, adoption would be a good solution to that problem.
If parents don't feel that they are adequate for being parents, they can give up the child for adoption. And again, make the decision that is in the best interest of the child, just as I demanded in my presentation of the courts. When you deal with a child, whether born or unborn, makes a decision in the best interest of the child. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would recommend that that young lady and everyone who has not viewed the movie Unplanned,
Right.
I'm not going into the details, but what happens to that baby in the process of an abortion is absolutely worse than slaughter.
Thank you for bringing that up, ma'am. I deliberately avoided showing you the gory pictures because I wanted to appeal more to your intellect and your, philosophical power of reasoning. But there is the emotional side too, and the emotional side is also a very realistic side. That's exactly what happens in abortion. Babies are being torn apart limb by limb, whether it is, and let's get into the detail a little bit, whether it's by getting the uterus vacuumed out or scraped out or poisoned with a saline injection, whatever. These are the methods. That's what happens. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I agree with you 100%, but I just wanted to add that the abortion, regardless of how it's done, is also very harmful to the mother. And especially the obvious physical harms, I think, I'm not even going to go into, but psychological harm, which just my own experience after 35 years of pregnancy counseling as a physician. Also, we housed 28 women in our own home for a number of years, and many of them had previous abortions, and learned an awful lot from experience. Just an example, I had a 70-year-old woman in my practice as an internist, had severe emotional psychiatric problems. Eventually, the psychiatrist figured out it was the suppressed memory of an abortion that she had when she was 18 years old. So, but be that as it may, also the important thing is that the women know deep down inside that it's a human life, it's a baby they're killing. And they also know, or they're having killed, and I wouldn't blame the woman so much because there's the culture and then there's the doctor who's doing the killing. But the important thing is that they feel they have a memory of a dead baby. And whether it's conscious or subconscious, actually, if it's conscious, they can kind of atone for it to some degree. Often they atone for it by having another pregnancy and having that baby, the feeling that, and that's not a very good situation either. And they're still becoming a mother. So I think those are very important factors to consider. But another issue is now abortion is becoming more common by pill. Better. We ever heard better healing by chemistry or something? It's better killing by chemistry through the RU46 pill and so forth. There is a reversal process if within the first 48 hours, and I've experienced about 5 babies have been born as a result of giving the high-dose progesterone, afterwards. But the last thing that needs to mention when people say, well, what happens? Well, obviously adoption is a very good solution, probably the best solution for most of these women. But often people forget that after the baby's born, the baby himself or herself forms a relationship with people. And not necessarily just the mother, but maybe the father, the rest of the family, and they accept and the person. And I've seen people come back years later and say, it's the best thing that ever happened to me that this baby was born. So to simply look at it at the point of, at birth as if nothing else happens. The child, being a human being, forms relationships and creates a whole new dynamic of life for that woman.
Thank you for your comment. Yeah, in response, only 2 brief remarks. And one is that, yes, when you look into the presentation that you have in your folder, in that slide on Planned Parenthood, there is the little partial sentence in there that says that, of course, these numbers only apply to the abortions that are done by abortionists in a clinic. And that does not include the abortions that are as a result of basically taking the pill or taking the morning after pill or whatever, because those are actually also killing human beings. And about the women who regret abortion, And I'm sure many of the ladies in the audience know that, and I have heard it because I have been involved with this issue for many decades now. Ask any lady who had a miscarriage about that, and even 30, 50, or 70 years later, she still cries about it, including my mother and my aunt.
Okay, I know
Yes.
we're talking about abortion, pro-life. I used to be pro-choice, I'm now pro-life. But we need to start looking at what they're teaching our young children on how to have sex.
Yeah.
We also need to address the men's part in getting a woman pregnant.
Sure.
Men are just as much a part of the equation and are affected by having their child aborted. So we need to address a lot of things, how to stop getting a woman pregnant, and not be so casual about it. I mean, I think we've strayed very, very far away from what God's natural law is.
Thank you for the comment. And if you look into the books that are out there on the table, the books especially about natural family planning that are in there, and this is a natural procreation technology developed by Dr. Thomas Hilgers in Omaha at the Pope VI Institute. By studying and getting involved in the observation of the female, the menstrual cycle, etc., especially among married partners, that education and that mutual involvement really helps. So I can only encourage everyone. I'm not a Catholic, I'm not a Christian, but based on the facts that I am aware of, that I know, I think it's sort of like Robert Jastrow is supposed to have said, we have a lot of philosophical and theological issues, and he compared that to, as a physicist, he was working at these issues, climbing that mountain, and only to realize when he got up to the mountaintop, the theologians were already there and were greeting him and helping him over the last step up there, over the last cliff. Just because the Catholic Church promotes something doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, okay? It's sort of the same educational process that adolescents go through, and I know I went through it. When I turned about 18, it was just because my parents said something was right. That didn't necessarily mean it was wrong, okay? Yeah, yes.
I've read a study that considering incest and rape, that those who went ahead and had the baby, none of them felt bad about it. In other words, they were all glad they did.
Right.
Of those who had the abortion, I forgot the percentage, but there were a pretty fair number of them that wish they hadn't done it.
Yes. If you go to many pro-life conferences, you're going to run eventually into one where you will have one or two speakers that were actually the result of a rape or of incest. Okay? And they're very happy that their mother decided not to abort them. Thank you.